All right, my name is Schmidt. We're here with Don Heistuman. It's February 26th, 2024. We're at the Nicholson Library at Linfield University in McMinnville. And Don, thank you so much for joining us today.
Truly my pleasure.
First question is, why wine?
That's a big question. I have always been interested in food, and wine came about as a part of that. And I just have always found it, and I mean, when I say always, I actually mean always, found it just extraordinarily interesting. Not just the flavor or the making or the wine itself, but the sociology and politics and culture. I just have found and continue to find it endlessly fascinating and endlessly reflective of society. Not our society, but all societies, where it is grown and made. I don't get tired of it.
Let's talk about a little bit of life before wine. Tell us about where you were born and raised and kind of...
So I was born in Portland. I was raised in Centralia, Washington, and Vancouver, Washington. As I said, I had an interest in food from an early age. Though my mother, being frightened of a dirty kitchen, wouldn't let me in very often, I tried to cook and do that stuff. My father was fancying himself a bit of a early adapter wine geek. I remember in 1968 visiting Napa Valley, and I would have been 14, I guess, at the time. And in the Heights tasting room with Joe Heights behind the counter, you know, talking to my parents and other people about the wine and me just hanging out. That's a pretty vivid memory for me. And then I really started getting into food when I went to the Evergreen State College in Olympia. It was the early 70s, and organic food and all that sort of thing was just beginning to happen. So I joined the Olympia Co-op. I had kitchens at our place. It's funny, I was just on Facebook, and something came up from the Olympia Food Company Co-op, and I chose to friend them. I don't know why. I have no intention of being back in Olympia anytime soon, but it was an interesting historical thing. And so that was, you know, that's how that really got me into the food thing. I was a music major, and so I left college after a couple of years to play music professionally here in the Northwest, pretty exclusively. And that went all right. You know, I didn't make very much money, but enough. Didn't have to take a job until the band broke up, and then I had to take a job, and ended up in a restaurant in Northwest Portland. As a dishwasher. And the restaurant was attached to a wine shop. So that was the beginning of my wine journey.
Well, before we pick it up there, let's talk a little bit about life as a young musician in the 70s. How did you find your band? And tell us a little bit about kind of the career arc for the band.
So I was in a couple of bands. The first band after college, we moved to Bellingham, Washington together, some college friends of mine and I. And then found some other players, and we played, you know, kind of rock and roll, country rock, R&B stuff up there for a little while. That didn't last very long, although I found my favorite guitar while I was there. Bought it from the singer who hardly played at all, and I still own it. Moved to Portland, found myself in a top 40 band, traveling Idaho and Canada, Western BC and Alberta. And that lasted for about 6 months. And then back in Portland. And the way you found bands back then is you answered ads that were in music stores. Kind of was how you did it back then. And ended up in a band with some people that I met through that. And that was a country rock band. And we played the club scene in Portland mostly, and then, you know, down to Eugene and Corvallis to a smaller degree.
What are your lasting memories of that time, or sort of favorite reminiscences of the time in the band?
I like the people, I like the music, I like doing it, I like the I mean, one of the things I tell people a lot is that I followed my passions for my living, which is why I left college. I never had a career arc as such. And I enjoyed playing music, and I enjoyed the people I was playing with, and I enjoyed playing in clubs. I find music to be also reflective of society, and find it interesting how music has been made over the centuries and it's continued to be made and reflective of our times. When I'm listening to modern pop music, I like to say I don't judge it. They didn't make it for me. In that context, when you listen to a Beyonce or a Taylor Swift or whoever is au courant, that music is being made for the people today. It's folk music to a certain degree, and it's fascinating to me. I love watching Taylor Smith. She's so charismatic. I will say for the record, I don't particularly care for her music, but again, she doesn't make it for me. And just to watch how people gravitate towards her is just amazing to me. It's just amazing.
So you're back in Portland after this, and you take a job as a dishwasher in a restaurant, and you're kind of wine adjacent at that point. So tell me about starting to work in the food scene and starting to become more aware of wine at that point. So
I think it was 1976. So wine was just beginning to get into the larger consciousness. Restaurants were beginning to be a thing. Café des Amis is the restaurant from that period that really stands out to me. L'Auberge also. There were others. And it was just fascinating. And then there was people at the restaurant that I was working at. I moved out of the dishwashing area fairly quickly. After about a month, I liked dishwashing actually quite a bit, but and we just would talk about stuff. We'd buy things, and things were affordable. If you saved your money, you could afford a first growth Bordeaux for $15 or something like that back then. And so you could taste. You could get a larger perspective on what wine was. And of course, California was just beginning. Oregon was just beginning. And so there was just that conversation and that interest. And then hanging out with the people I did, we'd taste together and we'd talk about stuff. Matt Kramer was just beginning to write for Willamette Week back then, and his perspective was always European. And the notion of terroir and being from a place, that always struck me and has always stayed with me.
So at what point did you start to consider wine more seriously as something you might do professionally?
Well, that wasn't for a few years. First, it was mostly about supporting myself playing music. So I worked in the restaurant for a while and started another band, and we were playing out quite a bit back then. But it wasn't really enough for a living anymore. But I was able to juggle that, ended up waiting tables a couple of places, but for the most part, for about 2.5, 3 years at Delfina's in Northwest Portland. Well, that's where it really started to when I was at Delfina's, where I was like, okay, I don't know if I can make a living at this, but I could certainly sell wine. And it became a focus for me in my work as a waiter to make sure that everybody had wine on the table if they wanted it, and the best possible wine. And then I moved to Seattle in 1982 and worked at the Four Seasons Olympic Hotel up there, just as it had been renovated. And the opportunity came for me to be, there was a sommelier position that became available, and I applied for it and got the job. So that was my first job as a wine person specifically.
You mentioned obviously selling wine before that. Tell me about the process of selling wine in those days. You mentioned just kind of coming into the consciousness of people. So how did you go about selling wine to people? Did you have to do a lot of education, or did you find people who were pretty attracted to wine already?
I didn't have to do a lot of education. I mean, I'm at a table taking their order for fettuccine Alfredo and veal saltimbocca. So then it's just a question, would you like some wine? And I might have nothing to say to them. They might say, yes, and I'll take this. And then you go, right away, sir, no problem. And then sometimes they'd ask questions. What might this be good with? And so I would talk to them about what I knew at the time. It was a long time ago, so I don't remember exactly how sophisticated I was. I learned about grape varieties and where they were from. And we were selling Chianti and we were selling Piedmont wines at the time. In addition to Oregon wines were on the list, and some California wines. So it was just about talking to people and being there where they are, which is honestly how it's always been, how it continued to be. Even as I went into the inside sales of selling to restaurants and retailers and people with more knowledge than just the average consumer. It was just greeting them where they were and talking about what they wanted and talking about what they knew and trying to add to that to the degree that I could.
So tell us about the Four Seasons. Obviously, that's a big place to work.
It was kind of fluky. I'd never been in that kind of fine dining environment before, and I was going through a divorce and just felt like I needed to leave Portland and just see something else. So I just moved to Seattle kind of on a whim. And I went up there and for a weekend or a few days, and I applied for jobs. And I can be a little pushy sometimes. And I went to the hotel. They were just reopening, and I told them that I'd really appreciate getting an interview quickly because I need to go back to Portland. So they pushed me through at the process. And even though I didn't really have a fine dining resume, they decided that I would be a worthwhile addition. And so I ended up waiting tables there, and I was there for about a year until the somm position came available. And I had already shown a great aptitude and interest in wine and learning about wine and all that, and they decided that I'd be right for the job.
Describe what that job was like, being the somm at a place like that.
So I was just a floor somm. The buying was done through a purchasing director. He was a wine guy, but he wasn't a wine purchasing director. He was just a purchasing director. So I would consult with them, and I would taste with them, and I would taste with the reps and stuff. But most of the job was on the floor, walking around, talking to people about wine. And I'd have some very sophisticated people, and we had a very sophisticated list for the time. A variety of old vintages. They had bought cellars, and so we had old vintages. First growths and Burgundies and, California wines and Washington wines, which were becoming a thing then also, and Oregon wines. And it was just going to tables and talking to them about wines, sometimes on my own, sometimes because a waiter would come and say, go talk to this table, we would like to, they're interested in something. And so I would go and talk to them about what they were interested in. Always talk about price, and then you give a variety of different price points above, at, and below what they're looking for and let them make a choice, and talk about why those wines might be good with the food that they're having.
You mentioned it was a pretty sophisticated list for its time. What did you find most people were attracted to? Was it a price point? Was it a story? Was it a region? Did you find that there were certain things that sold more wine?
Well, price point. Yeah, you get people there who want Washington wines. It's a tourist destination. But you'd often also get people that just want the best wine with the food. And sometimes they didn't know what they wanted. So that's when I would, talk to them about a broad range of things, both the local wine scene but also what they're having and what they like. Sometimes people, order a steak and they want a sweet wine. So you try to find them a good sweet wine for them, and try not to be judgmental. Not always the easiest thing, but so you try to save your judgment and mumbling under your breath for when you're walking away and not when you're at the table. But again, it's meeting people where they are and then trying to expand them a little bit, but without pushing them too far.
What were your impressions of the Oregon and Washington wines of that time? What were your impressions of what was being sold at that point?
I had already moved away from Cabernet and rich wines of that nature by that point. So I was not necessarily the biggest proponent of Washington wine at the time. I liked Oregon wines better. I liked Pinot Noir. I liked Chardonnay at the time. I didn't really think Oregon Chardonnay was all that much back then, even though I didn't necessarily know a lot. I'd try to, make analogies to Macon and things that had some acidity, but the truth was much of Oregon Chardonnay was didn't have the depth. It was more about the acid and not about the overall flavor balance that it had. But I thought the Pinots were delicious and would often recommend Pinots to people. And would recommend Washington Cabernets to people. I was a little more interested in California, perhaps, from a Cabernet standpoint at the time. And we had some interesting things. We had some old heights and things of that nature. And so, but what was interesting is meeting the winemakers and just seeing where their passions were and how they saw what they were doing, especially working in what were desert conditions in eastern Washington. It was before an awareness of certainly an awareness of natural wine, but also an awareness of irrigation and appropriateness and that sort of thing.
So what came next for you after that?
So I was the wine steward for about a year. I don't thrive in extremely formal conditions. So, as I said, I was going through divorce, and so I wasn't necessarily in the best frame of mind in general. So I left and waited tables in Seattle for another year, hung out, trying to figure out what was next. And I don't know, at some point I just decided I needed to be back in Portland. And I don't remember exactly why. I think it just wasn't working for me in Seattle. I wasn't playing any music, and that was still a thing for me. I had decided wine was a career, and it was something that I wanted to do, but I wanted to keep playing music also. So I came back to Portland, had a couple of bartending jobs and waiting jobs at first, and then ended up at a place called Paul Bergen, which became Ron Paul's, and was their wine director, among other things, barista and counterperson, all that. And then also started playing more music and joined bands and meeting people again.
So as a wine director at a thing like that, tell me about building a list. Tell me about, at that point you had a number of experiences, a number of different kind of wine places. So what was your sort of theory to building a wine list?
I don't know that I had a theory. I had my own predilections, which were more toward European wine. But both David Bergen and Ron Paul wanted to have a strong Oregon focus. And it was when the 83 vintage was just coming out. And so getting press and, that was something that helped put everything on the map. So, trying to find the wines to buy, because Ron wanted to put wines in the cellar and keep them, and to promote the region and the people. And so that was kind of the theory, finding a balance, but with a movement towards Oregon ones in general.
And so at this point, you mentioned wine was the career now. You were playing music. Music was something you wanted to keep doing, but wine was the career. So did you have something in mind as an ultimate goal? Did you have a career path or something you wanted to achieve?
No. I kind of take what comes to a certain degree. And I liked working for Ron, and I liked working for David, and I liked that job. But at a certain point, there was a chance. I don't remember the thought process exactly. But there was an opportunity. There was actually an outreach from my standpoint to go work at a winery in California. I had met someone from Deloach Vineyard and had a nice rapport, and I suggested that I could come and work harvest, and they said, great, come on down. So I did. So I left Ron at that point and went down and worked harvest, which was great. It was really great. I really loved it. It was wonderful work. It was just cellar rat stuff, and Deloach wines were good, but they weren't cutting edge then anymore, much less so now, but even then they weren't. But they were well thought of, and I enjoyed the people, and liked living in California. It was a good little sojourn for about 3-4 months.
Did you think about making it longer than that?
I would have stayed had they had a job for me. I wanted to come back, but it was a seasonal job. As it happens, the job ended, and then I ended up moving back up here. And like a week or less later, they called and said, "Well, I got work for you." And I said, "Well, I'm up here now." I mean, I stayed, and who knows what my career would have happened then if I'd stayed in California. But I came back to Oregon. It's my home.
What came next?
Then I went to work for Great Wine Buys. Rachel had opened the shop in the early 80s, and I knew a variety of people that had worked there, and salespeople when I was at Ron Paul spoke highly of Rachel, and I had met her and talked with her. So when I came back, Russ Rainey had been from Evesham Wood, had been working there, and he was gone off to start Evesham Wood. And so I replaced him. As it turns out I took his apartment too in Northwest Portland. That was just something I found out later, that he lived in the same apartment I did, right across from Ron Paul. And I worked in that shop for 2 years. And also worked part-time at the Ponzi tasting room at the time also.
So back into retail at that point, and was that different than being restaurant floor? Like how was the sort of the clientele customer base different?
Well, I don't know that they're different. Their needs are different in retail. They might be looking for a number of things. They might be looking for a bottle for dinner. They might be curious about different styles and want to take home a few things. You market them to try stuff. Rachel had what you called the case of the month. It was a case of, I think they still have the case of the month there. Fortunately, it's not $4.99 anymore. You'd put together, what you found that to hit a particular price point for the case, and that would be a range of styles and colors and stuff that would inexpensively open people to different things, and we had a really strong market for that. You would pair wines for dinner that night with people. We'd also do educational things. We'd have tastings of, I did a second growth and a first growth tasting at some point, which was fun. But we'd do, New Oregon Pinots, Burgundy versus Oregon, California Chardonnays, just whatever. We'd have tastings at night for people come and learn, and offer discounts for them to buy things. And it's just a different way of selling, not necessarily. When you're talking to people in restaurants, they're having a specific food, they have specific friends. You're trying to find something for that night in that circumstance, which would also be their taste too. When they come into a retail shop, they might be looking for something that night. They might be looking for something for the cellar. They might be just looking to educate themselves. Of course, you still have to deal with their tastes and their price points. And you might find that there's more interest in education, in learning about what, why, and where of something. So it's just a different perspective. Again, just meeting people where they are and just trying to figure out where they are within the context of what you're doing. And
you mentioned the Ponzi tasting room at that point as well. Tell me about that experience.
Oh, it was great. Not a lot to say. You sit there and you taste people and you talk about what it was. It was fun for me to get to know Dick and Nancy a little bit, and their kids were very young at the time, and how they got to where they were, and what their why and how they did what they did. I didn't spend much time in the cellar. Dick did that himself and wasn't that much interested. I found it, fascinating and interesting about how they got involved in the industry, and then through them learning how others got involved in the industry at the same time. I enjoyed the experience. It was a weekend gig. Talk to people again where they are. Didn't get to talk a lot about European wine, obviously. Talk about their Pinot Gris or their Pinot Noirs and their various vineyard sites.
And so that would have been late 80s at this point?
Yeah, late 80s. I don't remember exactly when I was working there, but I started with Rachel in 88 and was gone by 90, and so it was in that period of time.
What were your impressions of the Ponzi wines at that point?
Well, I liked them a lot. I thought they were really good. I liked the fruit. I was a little bit more tolerant of wood at the time. Not that their wines are woody. I don't believe they were, and I haven't had one for a while. I don't believe they are now. But at the time, I liked them quite a bit. I thought the wines were really good and expressive, and I liked the sites.
So you said you spent a couple of years of great wine buys. What was next for you after that?
That's when I got into wholesale. So through Ron Paul, I had met Dino Ariston of Domain Selections, and then got to know him better at Great Wine Buys. He and Rachel were friends, and his wife, Dimitra. And he wanted me to come to work for him a couple of times. I didn't want to make the move, but by 1990, I just felt like it was time to try something else. Had met the woman who had become my wife, and it just felt like a little more stable environment. And he offered me a job that suited me. It wasn't a straight commission job. It was a salary. I probably left money on the table, but I felt more secure. It's about my personality. And it was a one-man shop at the time. He had some other people work for him, even a business partner, but when I went there, it was a one-man shop. And so I was able to come and help him grow that business. And I was there for 18 years.
You had pretty much sold wine in every other conceivable way at that point. What did you have to learn? What was different about wholesale?
Well, the one thing that I was worried about when I first got involved in wholesale, and I had to keep in mind, was that rejection was going to be part of the deal. When you're selling to people in a restaurant, they want to buy wine. They're going to buy wine. It's just a question of what they're going to buy. When you have a wine shop and people come in, they're going to buy wine. You don't know what they're going to buy. You don't know why they want to buy it, but they're going to buy wine. You walk into a shop or a restaurant, they don't necessarily need you. Especially a small new company like what Dino had. They were already dealing with Henny Hinsdale and Lemma, and they didn't need those. They didn't need another wholesaler. I mean, it's funny. There are 30 or more wholesalers in Portland now. Back then, there were about 8, and it felt crowded, and everybody was kind of, like, what is Dino doing? What is he doing this for? And we don't. I mean, these were my competitors. So it's just interesting how things change and shift over the years. So to answer your question, going into wholesale, it became, a matter of persistence. You weren't sitting behind a desk waiting for someone to walk in the shop. You weren't, waiting for your table to get seated. You had to go get it. And that was, I'm not necessarily the biggest go-getter in the world all the time. And so that was a different attitude and a different frame of mind. And then again, you have to meet people where they are. I might decide that I love these European wines, these Italian wines that Dino had that were becoming very, very famous and popular. But you go into a Café des Amis or a restaurant with an Oregon focus, and it's like, you're not going to sell these wines, you need to sell these wines. And we didn't really have Oregon wine at the time. So Oregon wasn't a big part of what Dino was about. We were selling Cameron wines, but only downstate, not in Portland itself.
So the wines at that time that you were focusing on, you mentioned Italian wines, how was the portfolio being built?
I don't know that there was a focus. He had a relationship with a company called Estate Wines in California, which is mostly a California wholesaler, but he was trying to build a regional brokerage. And he was selling wine to us, and we were buying French and Italian wines from him. He had a couple of direct relationships. He had Greek wines. Washington wine was very big for us. Woodward Canyon at the time. We had Andrew Will shortly after I came in. I was able to bring that in for us. Washington wine was a very big focus for domain selections, and drove an awful lot of our business. We had some Australian wine also. I'm trying to remember the name. Click Imports, I think is what it was called. Didn't have Spanish wine at the time, but we ended up with Spanish wine about 10 years later.
So you mentioned the different mindset of having to be able to handle rejection and having a different customer base. So tell me about building those relationships. You mentioned obviously meeting people where they are and figuring out what they need for their shop. But how do you compete when when it feels like there's already a crowded market for that?
Well, we were fortunate in that we had things that were very distinctive, and I was able to find ways to play that up. Yes, you can find a Barolo over here, but these Baroli are the bomb, and talk about that in ways that people can understand it. So you taste with them, you talk about the history, you talk about the producer, what he's doing that's different, why it's different, why he's doing it. And you try to just have that kind of relationship. I never wanted to have personal relationships, friends as such. I just thought that was a dead end. I did and do have friends, but I never wanted to be their friend. Mm-hmm. I wanted to bring them what they wanted and what they could use. And I wanted to help educate. I wanted to help move the conversation along. And that became important to me, especially as we started working with other importers and other wines as I was in the job for a longer period of time. It became important to me that I could help move the conversation towards other things and make wine more interesting and broader than perhaps it was here in Oregon.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about that. Obviously, Oregon's always a little behind the curve when it comes to these sort of things. So how did you help push that forward? How did you help kind of maybe open some eyes here in Oregon?
Representing the wines of Marta Grazia was very controversial, and whose wines have not necessarily stood the test of time, but talking about those wines and the new ways that Barolo were being made and grown, much of which is positive, some of which the use of wood especially, maybe a little less so. That was one of the ways that I was able to help push that forward. Eventually, I was able to have a relationship with Louis Dresner Selections in New York. And then that was really eye-opening for me. I had already had a lot of the thoughts that went into what they did. I had long conversations with John Pollock Cameron about, natural yeast and minimal intervention. Thank you. In the winery. And spent an awful lot of time thinking about what that meant and how one does that, especially in a more complicated meteorological area like Oregon with rain and all the pressures that happen there. And so meeting Joe and Kevin and getting to know them and their portfolio and their focus, it really just rang with me. So when I started selling those wines in 2000, it really became a focus for me, talking to people about how the best expression of wine is when you do the least, which means you have to be very careful about what you plant, where you plant it, how you grow it, and so that when it finally does get to the cellar, you don't have to do anything. So that means you have to do all the work before it gets there. And I love that sense. And that for me is a wine of place. A wine of place is something that's grown. And so that when it gets to the cellar, there's not a lot to do. So I like to bring up Cameron because he grows well and Bill Wayne grows well. And they don't have to do a lot, even though, John is a very educated winemaker knows exactly how to intervene in all kinds of ways. But I love the fact that his wines feel natural and well-grown. And that's always been a focus for him, whether it's his own vineyard or the vineyards that he works with.
So I think that point is, I wouldn't say it's controversial anymore. How did it hit at the time in 2000? That's pretty early for that kind of.
Yeah, it didn't hit badly. I mean, I never used the word natural wine. I figured out very quickly that's just going to piss people off. And then you got to define it, and that's, which is still a problem. How do you define something like that? What is natural? I mean, the reality is the whole notion of planting a vineyard is intervention. So it starts from that spot, and the nature of making wine is intervention. I'll get in arguments sometimes with people about that we as humans are part of the terroir. The terroir is not just the land and the sun and the microclimate and the grapes, it's also the people, because the people can choose to do different things that are non-interventionist in terms of picking, in terms of the grape varieties they plant, that affect exactly what the wine is. So I just didn't want to get into that. Oregonians can be, at least my clients could be skeptical of that kind of hyperbole. I think the other markets gravitate towards those names and want to, glom onto a trend. I had the feeling right away that would not work here in Oregon. So I just talked about the wines. This is what they do. This producer, he makes Macon in a traditional way. He doesn't pick early. The wines can sometimes be a little sweet because the natural yeasts don't finish. They might ferment for more than a year before he finally decides to bottle them. And have already gone through malolactic, but still going through primary fermentations. And these are the natural expressions that these more dry, crisp Macons that you see as the rule are not really the natural expression. They're the expression of somebody intervening, picking way too early, chapitalizing, using yeasts, all the different ways that people can intervene to make a good product and put it in the bottle. These producers are letting the wine express itself.
So I'm curious about your role as the storyteller, or your role as the kind of the translator, I guess, of your meeting with producers, you're getting portfolio of producers, then you're having to tell the story. So tell me about getting comfortable in that role of taking someone else's story and using it to sell their wine and feeling like you can speak sort of for them.
Well, I took ownership. Which I do maybe a little bit too quickly even sometimes. But I took ownership. It's like I developed the relationship with Louis Dresner and Joe and Kevin and Denise, and then developed a relationship with the growers when I'd go to Europe and visit them. And I did that with Mark DeGrazia too. And I took extensive notes and asked lots of questions about how they grew and why they grew. And I would walk in vineyards and ask about the soil types, and would ask about how they make decisions about how they prune. I remember, I keep going back to Macon, but a Macon producer that I visited, and it was 2003 vintage. I think we were there in 2004 or something like that, and we talked about the vintage. And he said, it was very difficult because it was so hot. It was a very, very warm year. And he said that one of the things that helped him was that he'd always worked organically, and he had never, which you can't really do in Europe, especially in France, irrigate. So he had a very deep root system that could find water. And so the way he dealt with 2003 is he had one side that was on the sun that had more canopy and the other side less canopy, and helped shade that way. And then the plant found its own natural equilibrium in that. So I would learn that stuff by talking to people. And then I would just say, this is what he told me, But I guess so the ownership that I took was that I made a choice. I made a choice to work with this producer, with this importer. And I made the choice based on this, on these factors. And I talk about those things. And, fortunately, it's the thing you can do when you're working in wholesale that maybe you can't do so much certainly not at a restaurant table, but even in a wine shop. How geeky can you get with people? I can get pretty geeky with my clients as a wholesaler. So that was easier to do. At the end of the day, they wanted it to taste good, and that was really the main thing. I rarely would talk about how it tasted. I would always talk about how it got there. And then they would decide if it tasted good.
So you mentioned you were there for about 18 years. It feels like in that role you would be drawn to maybe producing some of your own wine, which I know is something that's coming down the line. So tell me about how that started to play a factor in your thinking.
Well, I have lots of opinions and ideas, and I watch how things were being done. And then I also watched the market. I mean, at one point I was ready to pull the trigger on some grapes here in Oregon, some Chardonnay. I thought that there was a place for an unoaked, pure Oregon Chardonnay that was relatively inexpensive. And I found some grapes. Unfortunately, it was a very, very rainy year, and I was ready to say yes and then just kind of try to sort, but it was just so moldy, and I just said no. But I just had these ideas about what could happen and how it could happen, and especially as I got more into the natural wine thing and thinking about, finding fruit that was ideally situated to an area so you didn't have to do that much to it, and then picking it at the proper ripeness, not over ripeness, which was becoming, in the early 2000s, the thing. It's like sous-maturité, right? Get it so ripe that it just was bursting with flavor, and that would get you points. But then you had to acidify, and you had to structure it with wood, and to do all kinds of different things, and that just didn't make sense to me. And so I started searching out red grape varieties and found Cabernet Franc in California, in El Dorado County at a very high elevation. And I pulled the trigger. I said, I'm going to do this. This was when I was still at Domain Selections, 2008 first vintage. And I created that wine called Bebame, B-E-A-M-E.
You mentioned obviously watching market, looking for an ideal fit of grape climate, all of that. So once you had kind of zeroed in on that particular grape, tell me about the rest of the process of the winemaking, naming, selling, all of that.
So I have a good friend whose name is Steve Edmonds. He has a winery called Edmonds St. John in California. And I told him about my idea. So he helped me source this Cabernet Franc from a farmer that he worked with in El Dorado. And it was just seemed pretty ideal. The wine, the fruit had not gone into wines of this nature. They would regularly let the fruit hang too long for my taste, and then do all of what I just spoke of. But we talked with the farmer and walked around the vineyard and decided that we could probably pick this much earlier and make the kind of wine that we wanted to make. So we pulled the trigger. We said we'll take a small amount from a vineyard called Camino Alto Vineyard, and we made the wine. It came in way too ripe, even though we picked very early. So Steve makes Gamay, and we had the idea that adding some Gamay to it would balance it. So we could still leave it as a natural wine and not acidify or water back or do any of that sort of stuff, but find balance through the Gamay, which is a high acid grape. We had to put in a whole bunch. It was about a third Gamay in 2008. But we learned a lot. And so subsequent vintages, we were able to get it down to as low as 1.5% Gamay. We learned about what we were looking for in the vineyard and the farmer and us. And so that the Cabernet Franc came in balanced all on its own. And at that point, we didn't need the Gamay for balance as much as for just brightening and brightening and lengthening and just making a slightly finer wine. Cabernet Franc was great by itself, but it just was better with a little bit of Gamay.
Did it do what you wanted it to do in terms of on the market? Did it hit the spot you were hoping it would?
Yep. We were able to buy it at a pretty good price. So we were able to offer it at a price that people could do high-end glass pours, could stack it and feature it in retail environments. It wasn't cheap, but it was about $20 retail. That worked for people. And I was able to garner some good press early on, and that helped a bit. I didn't look for press. I'm kind of anti-press, honestly, but it came to me and took it. So yeah, it did what I wanted to.
And tell me about the name.
Beba Me means drink me in Spanish, and my ex-wife came up with it. She lived in Spain, speaks Spanish fluently, so she came up with it, and I said, no, we can't do that because you can't promote drinking on a wine label in the United States of America. And then I was also leery of a foreign name. I always come up with lots of negative reasons not to do things. I'm Mr. No. But I thought about it for a while and realized we could not necessarily tell the full truth about the name to the TTB if they ask us. And I liked it. We liked it. We liked it as just that's what the wine was meant to be. It was meant to drink. It wasn't meant to age, although it does age well. 'Cause I've got a few cases of 2011. It's delicious. But it wasn't meant to age. It was meant to drink. And she found an old Alice in Wonderland through the Looking Glass book, like from the 1850s. Had a bunch of woodcut drawings in it, and it was all in the public domain. So we took one where Alice was holding a vial, and in the vial it said, "Drink me." So we took that out and used that picture for the label.
That's awesome.
That was all my ex is doing.
Love that. With a variety like Cab Franc, did you? Obviously, it's not an unknown varietal, but it's not one of the more major varietals. Did you find it difficult to find a market for it?
Initially, no. I think people were warming towards to Cab Franc. I had already discovered the joys of Chinon and Bourgogne. That's part of what attracted me to it. I wasn't looking for Cab Franc, but that's what we found, that we could do what we wanted to. Could have done it with Oregon Pinot. It's just too expensive for what I wanted to do. And would need more. Pinot just needs elevage, in my opinion. So no, it was an easy story to tell. We also didn't have very much, a couple hundred cases, So it wasn't that difficult a story to tell.
How long did you make Beba Me for?
Last vintage was 2017.
And what made you decide to stop?
I wasn't doing a good job selling it. I was very focused on my new business, PDX Wine, and I wasn't putting the time and effort into it, and I had made too much. I think had my focus remained on Beba Me and the larger company called Aha Wines, it could have been very successful. But my focus shifted. I started PDX Wine in 2011 with Michael Wheeler, my business partner at the time, and that became more of a focus for me.
Well, let's talk about that. So obviously you've been in the game a long time at that point. What was the impetus of starting PDX Wine?
Well, I had left Domain Selections because the business had sold, and I stayed to help in the transition, to help make it a success. But it became clear quickly that we weren't on the same page in terms of what we wanted. Stu and John were not wine guys. They had come from tech. They liked the idea of having their own business, but they had ideas around the business that were more about marketing, perhaps, and less about the, focus on, some kind of purity of wine and the things that I found most interesting. It wasn't a good fit. So after about 6-7 months, I left, and was going to focus on Aha Wines and Beba Me and growing that business. And I'd taken a couple of clients on from the Northwest as brokerage, working up and down I-5, Seattle to Portland. Might have done more with that. But then things kind of imploded here in the Northwest, both in Washington and Oregon, with Louis Dresner Selections, which was continued to be and still is very near and dear to my heart. And the opportunity came to be able to work with them again. and Michael had decided to move out from, he knew more about everything that was going on. I wasn't as clued into the inside stuff. So he was planning to move. He came out and visited me, and we talked for a little bit and hung out. I didn't really know exactly what his ideas were at the time. But then when I was doing a sales call in Seattle, everything blew up, and I found out that the distributor that had been working with Louis Dresner for a couple of years had just kind of imploded. It was a big, ugly mess. And then 2 and 2 came together. Oh, that's why Michael was down here. And so I called Joe and said, what do you think about this? About maybe me doing this, maybe doing it with Michael. And he thought that was a good idea. So we decided to do PDX. It made sense for me to come back to Louis Dresner. It made sense to work with Michael, who was a very talented salesperson. And I knew that we would be successful. And it just, financially it just made sense to do that.
Tell me about getting it started. Obviously, you're working with a known quantity in terms of Louis Dresner. Was there anything different this time around, starting your own thing versus what you'd been doing before?
Yeah, it's different owning your own business, right? Both Michael and I had a lot of relationships that we were able to bring to the fore, either right at the beginning or over a very short period of time as things imploded around the distributorships that were going south here in Oregon, in Washington. So putting that together, owning it ourselves, figuring out exactly what we wanted to do and how we wanted to do it, and still trying to find a balance between being financially successful and having, that pure ideal of what we think really great wine is, and finding that balance. And that was probably the big difference, is that the decisions were ours. I still had to work with Michael as he had to work with me to come to that balance of what that would mean for the two of us. But it's different than when you're just doing it for another person.
Had the wines you're working with changed at all?
Well, we started dealing with a lot more Oregon wine. That became a very big part of what PDX wine was about. We worked with one of the Spanish importers that I worked with at Domain Selections, but we brought on another one also. And the whole focus became more of a natural wine focus. We were dealing with importers. We worked with Kermit Lynch initially. That lasted for a few years. There was maybe a little bit more of a purity of what we were doing, especially in Italy. We continued to work with Mark de Grazia, but we were working with other producers that were not as modern in their approach as Mark de Grazia's company was. And the client had changed. People had moved from New York. People were more open to the idea of natural wine. We could actually use the word. So things changed. The restaurant scene had changed, tremendously over the years. The big change was Zephyro in 90 or 91, but then everything just kind of grew from there. And by the time I was back in the wholesale business, there was a whole new crop of restaurants and buyers with different focuses. And
so you had a new scene to get used to.
A little bit, yeah.
How did you approach that?
Well, one was we hired. We hired a young woman named Bonnie Crocker who continues to do a tremendous job for PDX. And she had a lot of relationships with these new people. Michael, as I said, is a phenomenal salesperson. He made a lot of relationships. I kind of moved into the background a little bit. I had never defined myself as a salesperson. It was a way to stay in the business. And they were all very good at it. And I had older relationships, and I kept many of those, and I would open up things and hand them to salespeople. But I did more behind the scenes things. I traveled more.
So you mentioned a focus on Oregon wine specifically this time around. Tell me about what you were looking for in Oregon wines and what you were finding at that point. What were some of the kind of the discoveries?
Well, I think a lot of it was a sense of change in Oregon. It wasn't as Pinot-centric, and we were finding and looking for things that weren't necessarily Pinot-centric. So we would have, our first Oregon winery was Teutonic. Well, they make Pinot, but they're more known for their white wines. And then we got a division. Well, they make Pinot, but they do Gamay and Cabernet Franc and Chenin Blanc. And it kind of went on in that way. So as we picked up, and I'm gonna forget producers that are dear to me, and I apologize in advance, but as we picked up, Johann, again, focus was beyond Pinot Noir. As we worked with, I forget what it was called, but Chad Stock's winery at the time did Minimus and Craft, yeah. And they did Pinot, but it's never been Chad's first love. And he was very interested in many other things. And so then when he went off, we of course ended up with his wines, and he doesn't do any Pinot anymore. We worked with Kelly Fox, who's brilliant, and she's Pinot-centric, but that might be the only truly Pinot-centric wine that we had. We worked with Ovum, but they were Riesling focused to begin with. Still do mostly white and lighter reds. And just went from there. Pinot was a part of the game, but what was interesting was people finding new expressions of what Oregon can be, and that it's not just about Pinot Noir.
Did you find it a challenge to introduce those to people who were perhaps expecting Pinots?
Well, perhaps, but that wasn't who we took them to. We took them to people that wanted something different, that were looking for something more. Plus, they were brilliant winemakers, and across the board. Chad is brilliant. Barnaby is brilliant. They're brilliant winemakers. They're doing really original things and really thinking deeply and broadly about what Oregon can be, and are very committed to this terroir. And so it was a pretty easy story to tell. We'd take them out, the winemakers, and they could tell the story, but then we could tell the story too, because we hired people that wanted to know the story and took ownership of the wines that they were selling. So it was a pretty easy story to sell, and we had Pinot to sell them. So if they needed Pinot, that's great. We can get you Pinot too. And it's really good Pinot.
So how long were you with PDX, and how did you see the business evolve while you were there?
Oh, it grew a lot. I was there until I was 24. So we sold the business in September of 22. And then I stayed through about this time last year. Again, the same thing as when I stayed with Domain. I wanted to help them transition. But at this point, I'm 69 now. Been doing this a long time. When I started AHA Wines and left Domain Selections, I really didn't think I was going to get back in wholesale again. I had good reasons, and I'm very glad that I ended up back in wholesale again. But in fundamental ways, I was finished, and had been for a long time. And so I no longer had the ownership. I had enough money to retire. That was key in selling the business for me. I wasn't enjoying it as much as I had hoped I would. And it was time to move on. So I did.
So how have you seen your relationship with wine change then, as all that is true, as a consumer of wine, as an interest in wine? How do you sort of approach it now?
Well, as a consumer of wine, it's the same. I love trying different things. I like things I liked before. I like things with acidity and delicacy, sense of place and beauty. I still enjoy all of that. I'm drinking much less now. That's out of choice. Part of it is I don't have samples that I'm bringing home, but I've never felt like I had to finish my samples. I could give them to neighbors, I could dump them down the sink. That's a really interesting question, because I've thought a lot about it, because it has changed my relationship with the industry and with wine. It's been such a focus, much like music was for so long, and it's no longer. Exactly what the focus is now, I'm still trying to figure out. There's a variety of things, including reconnecting with music to a certain degree, and staying connected to wine. But it's not my focus anymore, and it's not going to be. I mean, the sale of the business, I have a pretty serious non-compete. There's not much I can do anymore in the business. I can still do wines and things within that. And my daughter is in the business. She works at Maloof, and I'd like to help her, and I will if I can, and she'll let me, which she might not. But that help is financial. It would be her if she wanted to do it. But there's not much I can do in the business anymore, and that's good. That's fine. It's time for something new for me.
Did you find as kind of a theme in some of our interviews is you have a passion for something like wine, and then it becomes a business, and then it's hard to keep the passion because suddenly it's your day job. Did you find passion for discovering wine or passion for tasting wine waning at times, or was it still something you always enjoyed?
Something I always enjoyed. Yeah, I really loved trying new things, learning new things. One of the last trips I made was to the country of Georgia. Georgia's not that new anymore, and it's been happening for a while in terms of consciousness in America. So I wasn't the first guy to go there by any means. But it was just fascinating to see this ancient wine culture, so different than European wine culture in terms of how they approached it, and of course coming out of the communist era, and then rediscovering who they used to be, which had been greatly suppressed during that period. That was just a fascinating, wonderful trip in so many ways. Not just seeing how they make it. Of course, they make it in very distinct ways, in amphora, buried in the ground, long skin contact, all that sort of stuff. But just how they were coming back into touch with their own culture and what that culture is. Learning about Georgia and how they revere poets. And their poets have been their political leaders, and walking through Tbilisi and seeing this statue of that poet and this statue of that poet. And yeah, I loved it. That's great. I mean, I never got tired of that. I went to Italy with the Dresdner folks and had a fabulous trip for 3 weeks, driving around. Part of it, only a week of it with Dresdner, 2 weeks on my own. Going to people I already knew, but going to new producers and learning about what they're doing. It's fascinating to me. It continues to be fascinating to me. My daughter wants me to take her to Sicily. I have very little interest in visiting wineries, but I'll go visit a few with her, and I'll just be as enthralled as I ever was. But then I'll go back to the beach and give her the keys to the car, and she can go visit more wineries.
Go check out Mount Etna or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, which I've been to, but go check out the lava flows and all that, and not just the vineyards that are on this side of the hill.
So you talked a little bit about some of the changes you've seen in Oregon wine. Obviously, the people who are focusing on things beyond Pinot Noir. Tell me about other changes you've seen in the industry, both from as a consumer of Oregon wine and also as a seller of Oregon wine. How has the industry changed, and what does it kind of look like to you now?
Well, I think like everybody, I mean, you have people that are focused on their brands, and they make wine like they've been making for 20, 25 years because they have a market for it. But then you have people that question what they do, and they still make the wine that they used to make, but they're making new wines. They're making their Pinot in a different way. They've expanded their interest in Chardonnay, which has turned out to be a really good variety in Oregon, which would have been hard to figure 30 years ago. Rethinking Pinot Gris and what that can be here. But then finding and experimenting with new grape varieties and trying to expand what they do. Even an older line producer like Cameron, John Paul, finding different grape varieties, making pear cider, things of that nature. Then people like Chad Stock or Barnaby Tuttle that will experiment with just about anything just because they can get it, and which encourages people to grow it. It was one of the things that I thought I wanted to do with Aha Wines, is try to encourage people to plant some things, do something different than Cabernet Franc, but in that same style. I never got to that, but that would have been fascinating for me to do that. And there's clearly acceptance in the market for it. I mean, I don't have my pulse, I don't have my hand on the pulse of the consumer by any means, but we sold all the goofy varieties. We didn't need Pinot Noir in Oregon to sell when I was at PDX. So people are open to those things. not just the restaurants and the retailers, but the ultimate consumers, because they're drinking them, because they get purchased again and again and again. And so I think that what I find interesting and what shouldn't be surprising, and it's great that it isn't, is change. Is that it does continue to change and evolve. So you have old line producers that still make the Pinot Gris and the Chardonnay and the Pinot Noir they used to make, and they're not changing that. And we have new producers that are coming on making Chardonnay and Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris, not like them, but still just with that focus, but maybe with different vineyards and slightly different techniques in how they grow and that sort of thing, but still with that old school, old line approach of what Oregon can be. And then you have producers that are not taking that bent at all and just finding different ways to be in the business here. You know, I can point to, you know, there's a whole bunch, I can point to the work that the Maloufs are doing where my daughter works. And you know, my daughter has made a little bit of her own wine, and she hasn't, the only time she touched Pinot was when she got some smoke taint in 2000. She got some cheap, very inexpensive wine from a very famous vineyard that somebody turned down the fruit, and so she made a Pet Nat and a Pinot Noir, which was her first wine, but she hasn't touched Pinot Noir since. And that's, you know, that's where you see, I think, a lot of people coming into, where I see a lot of people coming into, and I'm certain there's lots of people that are going in to make Pinot Noir. I think Pinot Noir can still be made more interesting and better. And so I think there's still a lot to do there. I think Chardonnay, and then you see a lot of the young people coming and making Chardonnay and rethinking how Chardonnay is grown, how it's made, and making something that's really delicious. Change, and that's wonderful to see. It's not static. It's not resting on their laurels. This isn't Europe where you have to do the same thing over and over. You can do different things.
With that said, what do you maybe see coming next? Are there things that you're excited about on the horizon for Oregon wine? Anything you're nervous about, or anything you expect to have happen?
Well, I'm nervous about climate change. It's going to change what we do. But that has its own excitement. What if we find that Syrah can grow well here in the Willamette Valley, which I know other people have planted and are doing, and can they make it in that way that I believe Syrah should be, which is almost more like Pinot, more fine and delicate, really aromatic, as opposed to big and brawny, which is not to me a true expression of Syrah. I think the story is to be told. You know, you see people planting all kinds of different grape varieties, or people going back to I keep coming back to Chad Stock and the old Curry clone things that he has up there to work with, and then the plantings he did when he was with Kraft, and being able to take some of those cuttings and bring them elsewhere, even though that business was sold and he lost those initial vineyards. I don't know where things are going to go. You know, I'd love to see people plant Pinot Denis here. You know, people already have Lagrein here. What more can be done with Lagrein? You know, the greatest expression of Lagrein for me from Alto Adige is rosé. Could we make some really serious rosé Lagrein here? I mean, I don't know. Probably, maybe not. But just there's all kinds of ways to look at this and to find grape varieties that might work with a changing climate.
You talked about you're kind of looking for the next passion, reconnecting with music a bit at this point. What else is on your own horizon? Is there anything you're looking forward to personally, professionally, or otherwise?
Traveling, you know, without wine as a focus. Going to Mexico City in a couple months. I'm looking forward to that. Just being. You know, it's been great. I've been officially retired for about a year. You know, it took a while I continued to help for a few months after my official retirement, just with transitioning and stuff. But just watching everything kind of melt away, and just, you know, being and learning how to be and not be, what's next, and just, you know, being present. I'm a bizarre mixture of type A and slacker, and letting the type A, without just slacking either, and just sitting around in the house and reading or watching TV or taking a nap. And reconnecting spiritually a bit. I've been involved in Buddhism since the early 70s, and so reconnecting with that in a larger way.
And what would you say, as you look back, what are you proudest of? What is your greatest accomplishment?
I think if I've done anything, it is, along with others, broadening the sense of what wine is and how it can be in our society and in our lives, how we can use it to enhance our lives and have better lives, not just taste good or be drunk or any of the hedonism stuff, but how it really, the sense of wine being a part of our lives in a way that enhances our culture and our society and who we are. I didn't do that on my own. I don't know that I did it, but there were a lot of people, I think, took that attitude at the same time that I did. We all kind of helped work to that as we were trying to make a living and sell more wine.
Right. All the questions that I have for you today. Anything I didn't ask that I should have, or anything we didn't cover here today that you'd like to cover?
Not that I can think of.
All right. Well, excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time, sharing your story with us. We'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Thanks, Rich.
Thank you.